All right, good evening. We'll get started with our review session. If you guys have any questions, feel free to type them into the today's meet page. Thanks for being flexible about the start time. We had a birthday party that went a little longer than we anticipated, and so hopefully we haven't lost anybody because it's too late. But again, feel free to throw any questions at me that you guys want to for tonight, for tomorrow's test on chapters 9 and 10. And so the first question I see here is the question of what is a cabinet and why were they important? So the key thing to remember with the cabinet is we talked about how there's an executive branch, the president, who's at the top, and then he's got or she's got all of these laws that they need to enforce that are created by the Senate. And so he can't do all that stuff by himself. He's going to need assistance from people inside the government. That's what the executive branch is. It's the president and all of the people who are helping him to enforce his laws that he needs to sorry, not his laws, the United States laws. So you're going to have departments like the State Department or the War Department or the Treasury Department, like you learned about in this chapter, that deals with each of those different types of issues, whether it's money or foreign policy or defense. And then the heads of each of those departments are known as the secretaries, like Secretary of State, Secretary of the Treasury. Those people run the department that they're responsible for. They answer to the president, and they also serve as his cabinet or group of advisors who are giving advice to the president or insights as far as what they think should be happening. But essentially, the final decisions are left to the president if they rise to his level of needing to be able to focus in on that. Second question that's listed here, what is the difference between the House and the Senate, and what roles do each play? We discussed in class how both of these are part of your legislative branch, where they're responsible for making laws. They were created by the Great Compromise, and I saw on your questions a question about the Virginia and New Jersey plans, which is essentially the plans that led us towards the Great Compromise in your Constitution, where the New Jersey and Virginia plans were disagreements about what the structure of the Congress should look like. One, the Virginia plan is a big state plan that's discussing the creation of a representative group based on population. Meanwhile, the smaller state plan is talking about equal representation, which is going to give us a House of Representatives where you're going to have your state has, where it's going to be getting 2 votes per state. And this will allow us to then have a place for big states and small states to be represented. In order for a bill to go to the president, it must go through both the House and the Senate in equal wording. The only real difference between them is the requirements to get into them. The House of Representatives is a little bit more lenient to get into. They also have elections every 2 years instead of every 6. And then finally, a little trivia piece is that for tax bills or money bills, they must start in the House of Representatives. So that they're starting with some place that's really close to the people, since they're up for election so often. The next question that's listed here, what were the common and civil laws? These are 2 legacies that come out of the British legal system, and they're really straightforward and simple. The common law system is the type of rules or laws that are in place, not because they're written in the legal code, but instead previous court cases and traditions had always been this way, and so they essentially became part of our laws under British law. The civil code are laws that are put into place through statutes or laws that come through the legislative branch. And the civil code is going to be dealing with how people treat one another. So like a civil case would be somebody suing somebody else. And so that would be the type of civil case we would talk about, compared to common law, which would just be the kind of decisions that a court would make relying on previous examples to determine how they should rule in specific disagreements. Next question, what was the importance of the Society of Cincinnatus or the Cincinnati? When you look at this group, it's not a hugely important thing that's taking place, except for the fact that you're going to find that George Washington is going to try to create a secret organization with other members of the American Revolution. And when word gets out that he's creating the Society of Cincinnatus, there's an uproar from Americans who had heard all of this business about we the people and that how we're all created equal and we have certain inalienable rights. But then they watched as all of these leaders started trying to create these secret places where they could have like secret meetings and discussions and clubs. And there was a huge backlash about that. So the Society of the Cincinnatus is going to disintegrate pretty quickly in the face of all of this widespread concern. What's not going to stop is that attempt to try to create a class system where the founding fathers, even though they came from humble beginnings compared to British royalty, they're going to try to figure out ways to create elite classes for themselves. And one of the places you're going to see that is with the Freemasons, where a lot of them will join this secret society that has levels of membership depending on your importance and your willingness to work your way through the process. So that you're going to see from our early beginnings a lot of Freemasons working their way into positions of political power, which is going to cause a lot of Americans to become very nervous and suspicious about what is happening with this infiltration of something that seems to be designated a new class of people. So the Society of Cincinnatus is showing that there's this attempt to try to create a class structure, and sometimes through secret organizations or other sorts of clubs. Let me see here. Could I explain the Continental Congress and its importance? And so I'm not certain if I'm reading this right, and so you might want to follow up with a follow-up question if I'm getting this wrong. You had your Continental Congresses, your first and second, and that was around the American Revolution to try to figure out ways to organize the government of the United States while we were fighting a war. Eventually, they're going to create the Articles of Confederation as our first style of constitution to try to organize what the rules were for our wartime government. Eventually, we're going to have a constitutional convention that is being used to replace the Articles with a brand new government, which is our Constitution. So I'm not sure which of the two you were referring to, but that gives you both of them. So hopefully that helps you out with the understanding of what's going on with those. What should you take away from republicanism? Republicanism is the style of government that we have inside of our country, where we do not have a direct democracy. We instead have a republic where you elect representatives who have a guiding constitutional government that prescribes what our government should look like, sets aside rules for what rights can't be taken away, and within that framework, you elect representatives who inside the republic will then make decisions, and then you have the opportunity to vote. But the big distinction they want you to understand is you're not in a direct democracy where they contact you on every single issue and have you vote directly on the legislative process. Instead, a republic is built on a foundation that we are virtuous people who are going to become educated and work as Commonwealth men to protect the civilization through goodness and righteousness, and that we're also electing representatives to represent us. Let me see here. What is mobocracy? Mobocracy is what Hamilton's afraid of. Hamilton's very nervous that the lowest classes of people will gain political power or just aggressive power like they had in France during the French Revolution. And so he's afraid of direct democracy. And in fact, he's even worried about the version of republicanism that's prescribed in the Constitution. That's why he's helping to create like the Electoral College, to create a barrier between the popular vote and the president so that we don't end up with the common people making decisions that are seen as bad. We're going to find that after Adams's presidency, the Federalists are going to start losing a lot of support inside the United States because a lot of what they say sounds elitist, as they are very suspicious of what the common people can and cannot do. So I already got to the Virginia and New Jersey plans. So hopefully that stuck. If you need more help with that, definitely write a question later on to help me figure out what we need to clarify. But the next question is, what is funding at par? Remember, funding at par was part of Hamilton's plan, where he is going to pay back our debts at par or at face value. So we're not going to pay back just a portion of our debts. We're going to make sure we pay back 100% of our debts. And the reason why is because if we don't repay our debts to the people who lent us money, we will make enemies out of potential allies and will dry up a source of money that could be used to pay for big projects. For example, when we get into the Louisiana Purchase coming up with Chapter 11, we don't have enough money to pay for the Louisiana Purchase when we buy that land from France. We have to go out and find people who will lend us money in Europe to pay for that purchase. Fortunately, because of Hamilton's plan and where Europeans get the idea that we're a good bet to repay our debts is from that funding at par that Hamilton does, that demonstrates to the rest of the world, if you lend money to the United States, we will pay you back. Next question is about the XYZ affair. Remember, the XYZ affair was a crisis point at the start of Adams's presidency, where we sent over John Marshall and other ambassadors to France. They demanded a bribe from our country because they weren't very much happy with our country. They didn't like how the Treaty of Paris treated the French after the war was done with the American Revolution. They didn't like Jay's Treaty. Then they felt like America was becoming too cozy with Britain. And so instead of letting our ambassadors go directly to the French leaders, instead they demanded a bribe. And the people who asked for that bribe are nicknamed X, Y, and Z. What's going to happen after the XYZ affair is we're going to enter into something called the quasi-war, QUASI-WAR, quasi-war. And what the quasi-war is it's kind of it's a sort of war. We're on the verge of war and hostility. America starts building up a military massively that is led by Alexander Hamilton. We create the Alien and Sedition Acts, and we are on the verge of going to war, and we're also on the verge of trying to attack Democratic Republicans like Jefferson and Madison because they're seen as political enemies of the Federalists. And then, fortunately, Adams is willing to send ambassadors in 1800 to work out a peace treaty with France, and so that war threat drifts by. And so, thankfully, we didn't end up going to war. We didn't embrace the Alien and Sedition Acts as fully as we could have, which would have destroyed the Bill of Rights. And so we come very close to a gigantic incident that could have had lasting ramifications on our country. The next question. Why were the Articles of Confederation so unsuccessful? It totally depends on your viewpoint as far as whether or not they were, first of all. So remember the conversation we had in class, where we're still having a debate nowadays about what is the best type of government, whether it's a strong federal government or if we should have a weaker central government, all the way down to some people nowadays who still agree that we should have a very weak central government to the point of having a confederacy. So if you remember what was going on with the Articles, the benefits were the country had tons of freedom. The states were allowed to govern themselves. They didn't have to worry about a central government that could do anything to force them to do anything. The government wasn't allowed to tax or really do any major projects without a massive positive vote inside their Congress. And an amendment took a unanimous vote of all 13 states, which was virtually impossible. Your problems, though, are many. Number one, states were treating each other as mini nations, and so you would have them setting up taxes against one another. Each state had its own currency, making trade between them really difficult. Each state had its own militia, but there wasn't a unified defense that was going on. They were not repaying their debts, and there were European countries that were actively looking at America as a potential anarchy waiting to happen, and they were hoping to scoop up the remaining bits after everything disintegrated. On top of that, remember, our foreign policy was a mess, where the British were encouraging Native Americans to attack us on the western frontier, and the Spanish had shut down the Mississippi River, which they're only going to fix through Pinckney's Treaty when they're afraid of America's new strength under the Constitution. So in the Articles, we have tons of freedom, but as a result, we have a lot of things that are required of a new nation that our country was not taking care of because we had such a weak government to work with. Let me see here. Next question, why didn't the Federalists like the Bill of Rights? I would frame the question a little bit differently. I would frame it as the Federalists didn't believe that a Bill of Rights was necessary because they believed that Americans would be good enough to not require one when they were governing. And thankfully, the anti-federalists were willing to fight for the Bill of Rights, because we're going to find during the first 12 years of our presidencies of Washington and Adams, we had a number of different times where the president and people inside the government were tempted to roll back elements of the Bill of Rights because they felt threatened by either foreign policy or stuff that was happening inside the country. And so we're going to find that Bill of Rights, protecting freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom to bear arms, and so on, there are going to be multiple elements that we see in our early history where those rights are jeopardized because the party in power felt like they were justified to take that away from the people who are not in power. Let me see here. Do we have to know the 10 amendments tomorrow? Like what each one is in defense? No, you do not. We will hopefully have a chance to do a quiz later on this year, kind of like your 50 states tests and physical geography tests on the amendments. but that's certainly later on down the road. And so for you, it's just a good thing that we went through and analyzed them together. And in particular, remember the debate that we had in class where we focused specifically on the 10th Amendment, which was written by James Madison to try to rein in Hamilton's loose constructionism, where it says anything not written in the Constitution is not permitted to the government. But then we also analyzed how that should be compared to both the Commerce Clauses and the Elastic Clause in Article 1 of the Constitution, which says the Congress can stretch the Constitution to deal with issues that are emerging in their governance of the country. And so we find that those two parts of the Constitution are very much contradictory and cause a lot of our political debates that we have nowadays. Let me see here. Next question is about the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, and I'm glad that you asked about that because we did have to move very quickly through that at the end of last week. So when you look at the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, those are announcements made by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. For the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, they are written in a response to the Alien and Sedition Acts, and what they're afraid of is that the Alien and Sedition Act seems like a very aggressive attempt by John Adams to roll back a lot of protections that are given by the Constitution. So the Alien Act made it so that if you were an immigrant to the country, you weren't allowed to participate in an election for 14 years after you were naturalized, which essentially is denying voters to the Democratic Republicans. They were realizing that almost every immigrant was moving away from the elitist Federalist Party to the Democratic Republicans representing farmers and common people. And so there was an attempt by the government to choose who would win next elections by disqualifying voters by adding on a length to their citizenship requirements. We also found that the Alien and Sedition Acts made it illegal to criticize the government or the war effort or certain politicians who were in power, and it gave the president the opportunity to round up people that he didn't like and deport them if he chose to do so. And fortunately, that wasn't something that the Adams took as full extent as he could have, but he was given an awful lot of power that should have been prevented by the Bill of Rights in order to target one group, the Democratic Republicans, and in order to preserve the Federalist Party. Now, the argument was that they were only trying to protect against a French invasion, but really a lot of the decisions that were being made at the time were looking out for the idea of possibly crushing Jefferson and Madison and the Democratic Republicans, especially with the massive army that Hamilton had put together that he was hoping to use to crush the French and their French sympathizers here in America. So the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions have two different elements to them. Number one, they're going to say that it's the state's duty to protect their citizens from unconstitutional behavior done by the federal government. So they're trying to claim that the states get to determine what's constitutional and not constitutional. The second element that they're going to put into this announcement is they're going to claim the right of nullification, which means if a law is created that is unconstitutional, they're going to claim that the states and the individuals themselves get to choose what laws they do and do not obey by giving them the opportunity to determine what is constitutional. Now, the problem is what Jefferson and Madison are talking about could easily be seen then as a confederation rather than a federal government if that behavior becomes widespread. So what they're hoping for is only in really extreme circumstances like the Alien and Sedition Act will this be considered. Our problem, though, is the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions will be used multiple times in the future. Like it's going to be used in the mid-1800s by people who do not want to round up runaway slaves using the Fugitive Slave Act, and so they're going to choose to nullify that law. We're going to find it happens in South Carolina with taxes that South Carolinians don't like under Andrew Jackson's presidency. Southerners will use nullification to try to argue that they don't need to worry about United States legislation about slavery. And we'll see the same thing happening in the 1900s when many states will try to ignore desegregation decisions because they feel like it's a states' rights issue, not a federal government issue. And so we're going to see the issue of nullification be one of our central elements that's going to pop up over and over again in our course as far as we discuss what is the power of the federal government. According to the Constitution, the Supremacy Clause says that whatever is written in the Constitution or is federal law must be obeyed by the states and the people. But many others will look back to Jefferson and Madison at this time and say that there's a new interpretation that must be obeyed, which is the idea that the people are supreme. And so we're going to see that as an essential element of what we're going to be covering for the rest of our course. Next question, why did states need to vote for Hamilton's assumption plan? The Congress needs to make a determination about this because of the fact that this is a piece of legislation. So what's happening is Hamilton's coming up with all these plans, but eventually they need to be written into a bill that comes out of Congress, and then it gets approved by the president, and then that's when the laws can come into effect. So keep in mind, the president's only job is to enforce laws. So Hamilton can come up with all these plans, but it's up to Congress then to actually put them into legislation, pass them through. The president then approves it, and then we can start working with that plan. So this is your checks and balances and separation of powers. So that's why he needs to get the states through Congress to approve his plan. Let me see here. What is the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom? This is a document that's written by Thomas Jefferson that isn't the Declaration or the Constitution, but instead it's an extension of the viewpoints that you see inside those documents, where Jefferson is trying to claim that people should have the right to practice their religion without governmental influence. So what you see in the First Amendment is talking about how you have the freedom to practice your own religion, and the government will not endorse or create a state-run religion that everybody must follow. In Virginia, though, after that point, he's going to create the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom, where for their state, he's going to argue that there should be something even more forceful known as a separation of church and state. And that becomes the standard that many courts use to determine whether or not the government should be assisting religious institutions and coordinating with them, whether it's through relief plans or in many other sorts of religious rulings. It's the reason why you see a lot of heat going on nowadays when it comes to religious issues, because there are many people who will argue that interpretation is flawed since it's not part of our Constitution or Declaration. And so many people argue that separation of church and state is artificial because it's rolling this document into our official foundational documents. But that's where we get the idea of the separation of church and state, is Jefferson articulating that further for the state of Virginia when they separate church and state. What is the difference between an excise and revenue tax? There is no difference between the excise and revenue taxes. I think what you're blending together, an excise tax is a tax on certain items that are going to be used to generate revenue for the American government. We talked about two different types of tariffs, which is a tax on foreign goods. And so when people bring their goods into our country, and if there's a tariff there, we might have one of two different types of tariffs. One type of tariff is a revenue tariff, which is a very low interest rate tariff that is meant to put a tax on foreign goods so that people in America will still buy those goods, but they will pay a little bit of a tax that will then help out the government to raise funds so that they can then pay for whatever projects they're working on. A protective tariff is a tax on foreign goods that's very high, and that's intended to prevent foreign goods from having a competitive price here in America. If they add on a tariff of 20, 30, 40, 50%, it'll make the price of that foreign goods so expensive that Americans will decide to buy American goods instead of the foreign goods that they normally would be buying. And so those are the two different types of tariffs. Revenue tariff to gain cash, protective tariff to try to stop businesses from outside the country competing with our businesses. And you put a protective tariff in place in order to help your businesses grow without the fear of competitors overseas lowballing your prices and driving you out of business. Let me see here. Could explain why the Alien and Sedition Acts were being used. We already gone through that. What exactly was the Bill of Rights trying to accomplish? Bill of Rights is essentially trying to put into writing the exact rights that they were afraid that the government would try to take away from them, because they'd witnessed previous governments, especially with the monarchy, doing many of those things, like whether it's seizing weapons or quartering troops or preventing people from having freedom of speech. They're trying to write into the Constitution then specific examples of what the government can't take away, so that when we get into a time of trouble like the Alien and Sedition Act and the government can say, look, we have to take away some of your rights, the Anti-Federalists want to be able to say, you can take away some, not this one specifically. And then with the 9th Amendment, it points out there's a bunch of other rights that are protected as well that just aren't listed here. So it makes the burden very high for the government to start taking away your rights before it seems like they're going too far. And so it's meant to make sure that the government has certain boundaries that they can't get into. How was Hamilton associated with the Articles of Confederation? Hamilton is going to host the Annapolis Convention along with a number of other Federalists, and he's one of the people who is inspirational in the idea that initially the Articles need to be fixed, and then eventually he's going to be the one who starts pushing with Madison and John Jay through the Federalist Papers that we can't fix the Articles, we need to go with a much stronger government that will be our Constitution instead. Why were the leaders in the newly formed United States suspicious of the formation of political parties? The term that you want to remember is the term factions, and we discussed how in the Federalist Papers, James Madison was very nervous that our country would not be united as Americans, but instead we would divide up into factions that would stay more loyal to each other than they would to the country at large. And so they were very nervous about Federalists and Democratic Republicans because it seemed like the two sides were looking at the other ones not just as being politically different in their viewpoints, but as we see with the Alien and Sedition Acts, we see them treating each other as political enemies that should be persecuted or at least seen with suspicion and paranoia. And so we see a very troubling time period pop up where Americans are turning on one another because their politics are different from one another. And especially the Federalists are nervous because they believe the elites should rule. They're nervous about these waves of immigrants going into the Democratic Republican Party, and they're very nervous watching the French Revolution, where when they turn power over from one party to another, they don't do so peacefully. They cut off each other's heads. And so they're fearful of what might happen with the mob, especially since Jefferson and Madison are representing small-time farmers. What will happen when the mob takes over and the elites in the Federalist Party are toppled? They were not they're very excited about that. Next question, why didn't Jefferson and Madison like the bus? Remember these two terms, strict constructionism and loose constructionism. Strict constructionism means that you only believe that the government should be able to do what the Constitution describes in detail, and anything not written in the Constitution should be prohibited. That's where Madison's 10th Amendment is coming from, where he's saying if it's not written in the Constitution, it's not permitted. The problem is, the loose constructionists are looking towards both the Commerce Clause and the Elastic Clause in Article 1. And what their argument is that because of those clauses, the Constitution, if it doesn't say something about a particular topic, it doesn't mean they're prohibited from doing it, especially if it's necessary and proper for the operation of the government. So when it came to the Federalists with like Hamilton and Washington coming up with these ideas to add a Bank of the United States and all these other financial decisions that aren't in the Constitution, Jefferson and Madison felt like what they were doing was unconstitutional. Meanwhile, Hamilton and Washington will argue instead that if they're going to collect all this tax money to pay back our debts, they need an institution like the Bank of the United States to house those debts. And since we're not paying back all those debts immediately, we should have then this thing be a useful tool to help us with other projects inside the United States, since we do have this money that's going to be sitting there for a bit before we use to pay back all of our debts. Let me see here. What was the main difference between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans? You should take a look, first of all, at that platform sheet that I gave you, because I gave you a breakdown that has multiple bullet points that explains all the different reasons, all the different ways the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans are not similar to one another. Federalists love cities, bankers, factories. Democratic Republicans love farmers. For this chapter, the Democratic Republicans would be strict constructionists compared to the Federalist loose constructionists. We're going to find that also the Federalists are going to like England and the Democratic Republicans will like France when it comes to our foreign policy. But for these two groups, what we're going to find is that as we move into Chapter 11, a lot of the differences that we see are happening because the Democratic Republicans are out of power. So when they come into power in Chapter 11, you're going to see Thomas Jefferson and James Madison becoming much more like Hamilton and the Federalists than they were previously. And so you'll see on your platform sheet that I gave you, it stops in 1801, because afterwards the Democratic Republicans start looking an awful lot more like the Federalists with their embrace of loose constructionism or interpretation of the Constitution. Next question, did Jefferson like or dislike slavery? One of the trickiest questions you could possibly get into in our U.S. history books, and it's very much left to your interpretation to determine how much or how little Jefferson is doing to be anti-slavery. Jefferson is a guy who is a slave owner, and it's not through his family's wealth. Instead, it's through the family that he marries into. So he marries into a family that has a large plantation. For Jefferson, he is somebody who claims he hates slavery, but then he keeps his slaves throughout his lifetime, mostly because of the fact that he is going to find himself in really bad financial straits, and he's not going to be able to set his slaves free through manumission at the end of his life, except for the children that he has with Sally Hemings. His wife is going to pass away in Jefferson's younger years, and then Jefferson will have a relationship with his wife's half-sister, who is a slave on his plantation named Sally Hemings. He has a number of children with her that's been shown through DNA testing and through reports at the time that he and Sally Hemings were spending a lot of time together. And so there's very little confusion over what's going on with Jefferson and his relationship. We know that Jefferson tried to put in the Declaration of Independence the idea that he wanted to have an anti-slavery statement. But we're going to find also that when he's president, he is going to find himself stuck, because when he thought that slavery was going to die out on its own, by the time he becomes president in 1801, we've invented the cotton gin in the 1790s, and slavery is now spreading like wildfire, where everybody thought that slavery was on its way out. So Jefferson's a really tricky character in U.S. history, and when it comes to a cut-and-dried question like did he like or dislike slavery, I think there's plenty of evidence to show that he was troubled by it, but he is not a radical in the sense that he is doing everything he can possibly do to unwind the system. And in fact, there are authors during the time period like Phyllis Wheatley, who is a famous poetess at this time, and Benjamin Banneker, a famous scientist of the same time period. They both are on record sending messages to Thomas Jefferson saying, you and I both know that our intellectual level matches yours, but still you're not working actively to unwind slavery. Why is that? And then they don't get a satisfactory response. And so for Jefferson, he is a guy who is taking stands that indicate that he is sympathetic to getting rid of slavery, but as far as like radically doing something to get that done, he's not. Let me see here. Why is having different political parties considered not good? I think we hit that pretty well with the idea of Madison being fearful of factions. But we'll find that there are benefits that go on with having political parties, like uniting the country behind a majority candidate, and feeling the need to create platforms that will get a majority of the United States, or close to a majority, to vote for you in presidential elections, which will do more to unite than divide a lot of the times. Although we will find the parties create divisiveness that we'll see popping up all the way to today. Will we need to know about the Reign of Terror for the test tomorrow? You should understand from reading chapter 10 what the Reign of Terror was, that there was a French Revolution going on and upheaval happening over in Europe. So as far as will there be specific questions on the test, I will expect you to understand the material that you've read in your textbook and be prepared for any questions that might pop up about the Reign of Terror or the French Revolution in the context of the Washington and Adams presidencies. What exactly is the Society of Cincinnatus? I think we already hit that pretty well. Who are the British merchants? British merchants are just people who are selling goods here in the United States that they're making overseas. Which states were Federalist and which states were Anti-Federalist? It's not a state thing, and so it's instead the thinkers of the time period who are pushing for Federalist and Anti-Federalist ideas, although you will find more Anti-Federalists coming from what will eventually become Democratic Republican states, like Farm Territory has a more Anti-Federalist viewpoint as far as wanting to retain freedom and a weaker central government. But you're going to have a mixture of Federalists and Anti-Federalists spread throughout all of the different colonies, depending on what their backgrounds are and the viewpoints are. XYZ affair, we covered at the start of this review, and so I'm assuming that I covered that for you guys. What impact did the Whiskey Rebellion have? Whiskey Rebellion is going to be an event that happens where you have backwoods farmers in Pennsylvania who rebel against an excise tax that's being created by Hamilton to pay down our debts. There's going to be a rebellion where farmers are going to feel like they should use the same tactics as were used by the Sons of Liberty or George Washington. But what Washington's going to focus on is the supremacy clause inside the Constitution, where he is feeling like if there's a law created by the government, you need to try to address that through legal means first before rebellion becomes justified. And so for these guys, his argument would be that if you don't like the tax, you need to vote in new people or argue inside of Congress or do something to add an amendment. But you can't just pick up weapons as soon as you don't like the way that our government's working. Otherwise, that would be anarchy. So when he mobilizes an army, brings them out to the back country, he will suppress this rebellion. They will put some people on trial, but their punishment will be pretty light. And they're going to instead send a message to everybody that once the government passes a law, you must obey it. When we get to the Civil War and Abe Lincoln is looking for inspiration for what to do when the South starts rebelling, Washington's behavior during the Whiskey Rebellion is going to be one of the different things that he's going to look to as inspirations for how he should deal with the problem of the South disobeying federal law and seceding from the Constitution itself. Let me see here. Who did Jay's Treaty benefit and who did it affect negatively? Jay's Treaty is going to be a treaty that is very much favorable to the British, where they're going to get pretty much everything they want out of the treaty negotiations. They will make deals to vacate the forts on the western frontier. They do things that will help to ease trade between the United States and Britain, especially giving America most favored nation status, which means we get to trade with the British from that point forward. But otherwise, when it comes to navigation or other behaviors on the seas, the British are allowed to negotiate whatever deals they like, so that we're able to have a peaceful arrangement with one another. Hamilton likes that because Hamilton wants to have good relations with the British. Their navy will then protect our ships. If we're friends with them, they culturally, according to Hamilton, have much more in common with the United States than the French do. And so for Hamilton, he is going to be very happy with what Jay's Treaty does, even though for many Americans it's going to feel like we're caving into the British and giving them everything they want. Remember, though, when you look at this treaty, you want to link it together with the Treaty of San Lorenzo or Pinckney's Treaty, where as a result of this treaty, the Spanish are going to get really confused, and they're going to think that America and Britain are getting closer to one another, and so that's where they open up the Mississippi River, and they give a chunk of Florida to the United States, and they signal that they're very nervous that if the British and Americans are strong, the Spanish hold on their empire might start to crumble. And we're going to see that in the next few chapters, where America will start pushing against the Spanish, and eventually they'll get driven out of parts of the United States like Florida and Louisiana, and that'll become then American territory instead. Let me see here. Next question that I see here, can I explain the Battle of Fallen Timbers? Battle of Fallen Timbers is the major battle that's happening in the Ohio River Valley between General Mad Anthony Wayne, who is representing the United States, and Native Americans who are being encouraged to rebel against American colonization, especially the Miami Confederation, which is being egged on by the British. When the Americans under General Mad Anthony Wayne drive off the Miami Confederation, you're going to have then a treaty called the Treaty of Greenville, where the Native Americans will give up their land in this area, allowing westward settlement, and it's going to push them further back out of the way out of United States settlement that's happening further out west. And that's the reason why that battle and the treaty is so important. Let me see here. If James Madison was a Federalist, why did he write the Bill of Rights? You need to keep in mind that he was a Federalist when they were creating the Constitution. And then when the presidency went to Washington and he started listening to Hamilton, you need to keep in mind the term loose constructionism versus strict constructionism. Madison's going to be very nervous that Hamilton is doing things to stretch the Constitution, and Madison doesn't like the direction that that's going. So while he was a Federalist when creating the Constitution, he starts working with the Anti-Federalists to build the Bill of Rights to try to rein in what Washington and Hamilton are doing to try to stretch the Constitution with the Bank of the United States. And so that's the reason why he's doing that, and why eventually Jefferson and Madison will start a brand new party called the Democratic Republicans, because they both are suspicious that Hamilton is going too far. And you can see that eventually with the Alien and Sedition Acts under Adams, And then Jefferson and Madison creating the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, where they're arguing that the government is starting to get too powerful and they're nervous about what that's going to lead to. Let me see here. What is nullification? Nullification was what I described in the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, where Jefferson and Madison are arguing that it's the state's job to defend people's constitutional rights. And then they also argued that people have the right to nullification, which means they should be able to ignore federal laws that they feel are unconstitutional. The problem with nullification, though, is this essentially would turn our government into a confederacy, where if you didn't have to obey federal law because you felt it was unconstitutional, we would then have the government lose its power to be supreme. And the problem with the nullification the nullification plan that Jefferson and Madison talk about is it's flying totally in the face of the supremacy clause, where in the Constitution it says specifically if the Constitution or the federal government creates a law, you have to obey it no matter what. And so this is a sign of desperation, where Jefferson and Madison feel like they're under attack from the Alien and Sedition Acts, and so they're advocating a really extreme response to what the government's doing with the Alien and Sedition Acts. The problem that we're going to see, like I mentioned earlier in the video, a lot of states will start using this as a reason then to not obey federal laws that they don't like, and whether it comes to slavery or civil rights or the run of fugitive slaves or any other laws that we find even nowadays where people argue they don't need to obey them because they don't like them, because they're unconstitutional. We find that this is still an eternal element of our country, where we're still debating this issue even now. Let me see here. What was the point of a direct contradiction in the Constitution of the elastic clause in the 10th Amendment? The problem that you have is they're being written at two very different times, with two very different understandings of what's taking place. So for Madison, when they're creating the Article 1 in the Constitution, they're trying to figure out how they're going to create a legislative branch, and it's full of compromises. So it's not just Madison writing, it's all of these different hands are involved that are talking about this is the power of the legislative branch, one of those powers being the elastic clause, also known as the necessary and proper clause, where it's essentially a catch-all. It's kind of like if you wrote in an essay, there's a bunch of other things that were happening during this period too, and you just don't have the time or the energy or the ability to go into detail about all the different things that could possibly apply to your topic. That's what they do with Congress, assuming that it'll be figured out later on. The problem is the elastic clause is so big and so broad that it could be interpreted a bunch of different ways, including the way that Hamilton interprets it by creating a Bank of the United States. So what Madison's trying to do retroactively is he's trying to create a 10th Amendment that is trying to rein in that power. But then the question is, when he puts in the 10th Amendment that whatever is not permitted by the Constitution then is power reserved to the states or the people, the problem is the Constitution has already given a lot of that power to the federal government through the elastic clause. And what that means in the future is that you'll have very different political party viewpoints, where like nowadays you have Republicans who will argue in many cases for strict constructionism, where they'll argue on Madison's side that many different things, whether it's the Affordable Care Act or same-sex marriage or any of these other things, should not be constitutional because they're not in the Constitution itself. The problem is, from that first moment, the cat's out of the bag, where if you have other people saying, no, the elastic clause allows loose constructionism of the Constitution, each side has founding fathers on their team. And even harder in this situation, both sides have Madison, where at one time he's endorsing the Constitution, and then later on he's creating this 10th Amendment. And so you've got this contradiction that's sitting inside the Constitution that creates our two major political parties that we have now, and the disagreements that they have on virtually every issue that they have currently. Let me see here. It looks like that's the last question I see on our review page. I'll hang out for just another couple seconds to see if any other questions pop up from you guys. For you guys, hopefully you had a really nice MEA break. I'm excited to see you guys tomorrow, so hopefully you guys are ready to go with Chapter 9 and 10 test tomorrow. Let me see here. I don't see any other questions. So hopefully that means that you guys are good to go. Feel free to come in and stop by and see me before class or before school if you guys need any other additional help. But we'll get rolling with the test as soon as you walk into class. And then we'll start diving into Chapter 11 starting on Tuesday. I know we're going to rush it a little bit, but for us, we do have a good amount of content that we need to cover over the next couple weeks. So when we get finished up with the test tomorrow, make sure you're working on Chapter 11 tomorrow night so you're able to dive into that content then. Good luck with your review tonight. I look forward to seeing you tomorrow, and thanks for joining me. Have a good night.